This is We Need to Talk with Dr. Darcy Sterling, where I give you the tools and skills you need to love better so you can live better. There's nothing quite like the feeling you get when your new relationship becomes official. That shift from dating into knowing that you and your partner are truly becoming a team. You have a ritual for when you see each other. You're beginning to have a framework for moving through the world and your lives together. For so many people, that is both grounding and intoxicating all at once. But it is almost inevitable that as familiarity grows and partners become more secure with each other, that initial passion, it starts to wane. And it doesn't just happen when a new sense of security takes the place of the honeymoon stage of your relationship. It actually happens again and again throughout the course of our relationship and our life together. It is the paradox of long-term relationships that the stuff that you need to keep a partnership alive over years or decades is the exact opposite of what you need to maintain a fulfilling sex life. I recently had friends over at our place. Let's call them Claire and Ben. They are a couple, and we are having a great time in the backyard. We are talking about my favorite topic, which is relationships. And Claire turns to her husband and says, I love our relationship, but honestly, I miss cheating. And we all froze, for different reasons. It's me, my wife, Steph, and her husband, and Claire. And just as I am sure that this night is about to transform into something that none of us signed up for, Claire says, I love you, Ben, but I really miss feeling like I could lose you. That right there, that's the paradox of a long-term relationship. The very stability that gives us comfort also diminishes the excitement that makes us long for our partner. Dr. Emily Jamea is a sex therapist and author of Anatomy of Desire: 5 Secrets to Create Connection and Cultivate Passion. And she is here today to discuss why sex changes in long-term love and what we can do to keep it thriving. Can you explain the paradox of long-term relationships as it relates to sex? And by that, I mean specifically, what are the things that make sex amazing? And how do those things tend to change when we enter a long-term relationship?
I think there are 2 key components that make sex amazing early in the relationship, and those are novelty and neurochemicals. So humans crave novelty. We get excited when there is something new to explore. So when we meet someone for the first time and everything is fresh and we're getting to know each other, it's exciting. We're learning each other's bodies. It's new and we feel great about ourselves, about our relationship. But a lot of that feeling is also flooded by this neurochemical rush that we get in the early days. So we get flooded with dopamine, we get norepinephrine, which makes us kind of energized and charged. And we get a lot of oxytocin from all of the close physical proximity and sex and touch. But we also get a dip in serotonin, which is what gives us that kind of anxious, obsessive feeling with a new partner. Because if you think about it, people who have low serotonin levels have anxiety issues, OCD, that sort of thing. So that sort of, those sleepless nights when we're wondering if our partner is going to call or text back, that's all because we get a drop in serotonin. So it's not all good in the early days, which I think we have to remember.
I think that's such an important point. And I think that a lot of people who crave certainty and the safety that comes from a long-term relationship will really relate to those beginning months, they're great. But I personally also can't wait to get past that
Yeah.
because of
Yeah.
that very thing that you just described.
Right. It makes us very antsy. We feel kind of insecure, and that's mixed with all of this arousal, of course. So it's good, but it's also confusing. I mean, it's sort of a double-edged sword.
Some people make it sound like in the beginning, there was this X factor that caused us to be so attracted to each other. People make it sound like it's fairy dust or magic because it seems to disappear in some very predictable ways. And I can't help but wonder how much of that could we avoid if we just didn't cohabitate, if like maybe we didn't move in together, if we didn't require our romantic partner to also be compatible with us in like how we want to manage our home and our finances, would it be better if we didn't require them to mirror our levels of cleanliness and organization? And like if they didn't have to manage chores with us, like, would we be better off if they just lived down the street?
I'm going to say no. I think that sounds like a potentially great solution and one that might work for some people. But I mean, I'm a logical person at the end of the day, and I just don't think for the average person that makes a lot of economic sense, especially long term. If what you're wanting is a long term relationship with some degree of stability, I think your money is better spent on doing things, and there are plenty of things we can do to keep our relationship fresh and exciting, even if we're still under the same roof rather. I think that when Esther Perel first came out with kind of her passion paradox and, do sex and love really go hand in hand, a lot of people took from that the answer is more distance. And I don't know that that's necessarily what she meant, but I had couples come through my office around the time that Mating in Captivity came out with that exact proposition. Like maybe we should just live separately and that would be the answer to all of our problems. But there's just other logistics that you have to manage. I mean, I think a lot of people would feel that it gets a bit tiresome maybe to drag your stuff from one person's house to another. And like I said, it's kind of a strain on the bank account too at the end of the day. So I think there are plenty of other solutions to keeping passion alive in long-term relationships that also make a lot more sense.
Well, that's great because that's why you're here, and I'm looking forward to hearing those. I do also want to caveat or add to the dialogue the fact that one of the biggest determinants in how we're doing financially and economically has to do with divorce. If we can bypass divorce, those of us who manage to bypass it do much better off long term than those of us who have to go through it. And as you well know, the stats are like just north or south of 50% of every marriage ends in
Yeah.
divorce. So given the reality of the outcomes of marriage and long-term relationships, I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say about how do we cohabitate and get all the good
Sure.
stuff of living together and also keep our passion alive and
Yeah.
thriving. But for a shortcut, I don't know, man, about this whole cohabitation thing. But maybe by the end of the conversation, my
Sure.
feelings will be different. Um,
Yeah.
I am a numbers person. I know that it varies from couple to couple, but how often should we be having sex?
Okay. I know everyone wants to know what is the magic number. So the first thing I'll say is quality over quantity is more important. As Emily Nagoski says, pleasure is the measure of a satisfying sex life, not how frequently
Mm.
you're having sex, but the quality of your sexual interaction. And the fact is, in long term relationships, sex is going to ebb and flow. There may be periods of time where suddenly you feel like you're back in the honeymoon stage again and you can't keep your hands off of each other. And then there may be kind of dry spells, like when you have a new baby in the house and you're sleep deprived and stressed out, or you are sick for a period of time, or you're recovering from something, or there's a lot going on at work. I mean, there's just tons of factors that come into play. So, for those reasons, I don't like to give people a specific number that they should keep in mind because I don't want them to think that if a little period of time goes by when they're not hitting that mark, that's a sign that something's wrong. That being said, and I think this will answer your question and hopefully satisfy you a little bit. What I encourage couples to do is at least once a week, set aside some time to focus solely on each other. And that may or may not include sex, but I want people to use that time to maintain some kind of erotic energy, whether it's, being playful or flirtatious or taking a shower together or just making out or cuddling. I think a lot of times people are very black and white when they think about what sex is, and they think
Mhm.
of it just as, intercourse, but sex can be so much more than that. I had one couple in my research study who talked about sex being this sort of constant energetic charge in their relationship, that they could turn the heat up or down just depending on what was going on. And it was something they kind of dipped in and out of, as opposed to it having a beginning, middle of it, and an end. And I love thinking about it like that. So you want to think of it more as an energy that you're maintaining, to some degree, maybe even on a daily basis. But I would say at least once a week for 20 or so minutes, have some undivided time where there's at least physical touch and closeness in some way. And that doesn't have to include sex, but that can go a long way in preventing couples from slipping totally out of practice.
And to that end, what is considered sexless? Because I have had people tell me in the past, oh, less than like once a month sex is considered a sexless marriage. Is that
Yeah,
right? Or a sexless
it is.
relationship?
Yeah, less than once a month is what most of the, experts would consider to be relatively sexless. You
So
know
less
what?
than 12 times a year?
Yes, but we have to remember there are plenty of people who feel completely satisfied mutually because maybe
Mhm.
they're having really great sex once a month and they're happy with that. So I'm kind of like, don't make something a problem if it's not a problem. I've had couples come in worried that there's something wrong with them because they read in like a women's health magazine that they should be having sex once a week and they're having sex once a month. But when I interview them, I find out that they're both happy with that number and they both feel satisfied with that. And maybe they want to spend their time doing other things. And the frequency of sex is not having at all a negative impact on their relationship. And so I'm like, you don't need my help. There's nothing wrong with you. So sex is one of those things that compared to other measures of health, like, healthy range of blood pressure or heart rate or, any measure of health, there's kind of a narrow range, I think, of what is considered normal and healthy. We can't put sex into a very narrow range because there is so much space for individual differences. And so I really encourage all of my couples to, figure out what's normal and healthy for them. Where couples run into trouble is when there's a big difference from what one person wants or needs versus the other person. So when there's a gap in desire in terms of how frequently you want sex or a big difference in terms of your sexual preference, that's where couples can kind of struggle.
And doesn't that get even more complicated because the researcher in me wants to ask you for a way of determining where you're each at very early on in the relationship, but the neurochemicals get in the way of that because we all just want to have sex 24/7 in the beginning. And much of
Right.
that is the influx of all those neurochemicals that are flooding our system. So I'm going to ask you anyway, though. Like, is there a way of determining early on the extent to which we're compatible with each other?
I think it's important to have some degree of conversations about sex early on in the relationship if it's a partner who you are considering keeping around for the long term. And so while I discourage people from asking their partner nitty-gritty details about their sex and relationship history, because we don't need all of the information, it's generally important to know, how much they value sex in a relationship. Beyond that, like what is it that they get out of a sexual experience? Do they just need to have, pretty frequent orgasms, or is sex really an opportunity for love and connection? What kinds of things are going to make someone know that they feel sexually satisfied that can look different for different people? Do they have any preferences that they haven't shared, but might be important to know, any little kinks that they haven't expressed, desires,
Yeah.
fantasies, that sort of thing. How comfortable and willing are they to kind of navigate and adapt to some changes that are inevitably going to occur? I may be getting a bit ahead of myself, but I think one of the biggest blocks for people is when something happens in life, whether it's, a physical change or something in the environment, and suddenly they can't have sex the way they're used to having it. And so they stop having it rather than maintaining a more open mind about alternative ways they
Mm-hmm.
can kind of keep that erotic spark alive. And so those are the kinds of conversations I encourage people to have early on in the relationship, which I think will really help a couple determine how sexually compatible they'll be in the long term.
And I suspected from the way you started that answer that one of the questions you caution people against asking is like, so how many sex partners have you had? Like, what's your number? And I agree with you. But because I'm a numbers person, and I'm going to come back to this,
Sure.
is it at all helpful or reasonable to be like, so in a long-term relationship, what's your cadence generally? Like, what's the longest period of time you've gone without sex, and have you been comfortable with that? And people never talk about this. Is that a fucked up thing to ask early on?
I don't think it's no, I think it is okay to ask early on. But what we have to remember is that in a lot of different categories, our thoughts and feelings about things are going to evolve with time. So you do the best you can to kind of have a sense. That's why I say rather than saying, how frequently do you expect to have sex? How important is it to you in the relationship? And during the inevitable period of time that one of us may not be as sexually available, what are other ways that you feel love and connected, or, things that you can do that are pleasurable to you? Would you be satisfied, masturbating sometimes just to kind of now, bridge the gap if there is one? So those are the more important questions that I think are worth having a conversation about. Anything that couples are talking about early in the relationship, you want the questions to be more open-ended than close-ended. That's what's going to lead to richer, deeper, more meaningful conversation, I think, and really help one person understand the other.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
In your experience, what's one unexpected habit, like one unpredictable or less known habit or behavior that couples either do or don't do that then erodes desire over time?
I think a lot of people don't realize how complacent and lazy they get when it comes to maintaining the erotic spark. There's this idea that everything was effortless in the early days, but it was anything but. I mean, there was a ton of planning and preparation that went into maintaining an erotic connection and a lot of excitement that went into that. And so the answer, I think, is that we have to make the transition from passive intensity to active intensity.
I love
And
that. I love that
I,
because what you're speaking to is the motivation. It's like,
yeah.
yes, well, actually, what you're speaking to is the behavior. And I think what people harken back to is like, but I was intrinsically motivated to do it.
Mhm.
Yes, you actually weren't, though. Your brain, you were high for months and months and months, and that was your motivator. That's going to diminish over time. And now we
Mhm.
have to replace that with some mindful practices. But please
Yeah,
continue.
absolutely. Intentionality. And I love that you said intrinsic motivation because that's something I write a lot about in my new book. So I draw from science on flow state to kind of give people a new framework or model for keeping the sexual spark alive. And for people listening who don't know what a flow state is, it's when we are engaged in activity in which we experience loss of space and time. It's like the world around you disappears. You feel total focus and complete absorption. Think of a surfer who's at one with the wave, that kind of thing, a sense of unity and merger. And I think that's what a lot of people want to feel during sex. And one of the key components of flow is that the experience is autotelic. What that means is that it's intrinsically rewarding
Yeah.
to your point precisely. And I don't know about you, but to me, there's something a lot more special about my partner doing things to actively cultivate desire and connection rather than kind of that effortless, passive approach that happens early on. I just think to me that feels a lot more special. But this is where a lot of couples get hung up because when that initial relationship energy fades and that initial intensity starts to transition into intimacy,
Mm,
The walls can go up. That's when people's issues with vulnerability show up. And suddenly you're seeing maybe aspects of your partner that are a bit less desirable. And that's when we move from falling in love to love as a verb. And this is
hmm.
what trips people up. And so, in the research I did looking at couples who sustain passion and long term relationships, they were very clear about the kinds of things they did to transcend that blip that everyone goes through.
What exactly was the research that you did?
So I took a group of people and I administered a sexual satisfaction questionnaire. And then I asked them to think about a really great sexual experience that they had had in the last couple of months. And I administered a flow state questionnaire to see if what they were experiencing during great sex was indeed a flow state. And I found out that yes, it was. And not only that, people who got into a flow state were more likely to be sexually satisfied. In other words, flow state was a predictor of sexual satisfaction. So it wasn't just that it was correlated, it was predictive. And what this meant is that just by teaching people about flow state and how to get into a flow state during sex, like I said, we kind of created this new model for approaching issues around desire and satisfaction. What I did then was call up my research participants who got the highest scores and had really long conversations with them about the kinds of things that they did to get into a flow state. And that's what ultimately set the foundation for the book.
Wow. So it was a qualitative research study. That
It
means
was, yeah,
hundreds and
both.
hundreds of pages, written work, and like
Oh, yeah.
probably multiple years of what I spent doing my quantitative research study.
Yes, yes. It was both quantitative and then followed up with qualitative. And yes, to the years and hundreds of pages.
Oh my gosh. And what was the
Yeah.
question that you were answering?
What is the relationship between flow state and sexual satisfaction?
I love
That was
that.
pretty much
I
it.
love that. And
Yeah.
so your findings were that people who understood how to access a flow state during sex were more
Mhm.
likely to report sexual fulfillment.
Precisely. Precisely.
Mm,
Like way
Makes a
more likely. Yeah.
Yeah,
hmm
makes a
hmm
lot of sense. Did they have to be able to hit that flow state outside of sex? Did that make them more likely to hit it when they're in sex or having sex?
So I didn't ask about that specifically, but what came up during the interviews is these kind of five core themes that each has a chapter in the book. So we've got sensuality, curiosity, adaptability, vulnerability, and attunement. They all
Mm.
talked about accessing those qualities outside the bedroom. So there is definitely, I think, a transition of energy into how you live your life and how you relate to your partner that has a direct effect on the way you connect erotically.
And that makes so much sense. Who we are
Yeah.
out of the bedroom is usually a version of who we become in the bedroom. We don't transform into like this other version of ourselves.
100%. Something I write, I think like it came up three times throughout the book is that you cannot separate your sexuality from your individuality. Elements of who we are, it's impossible to hide all parts of ourselves. Otherwise, we'd bring nothing to the bedroom. And so, yes, the better we understand ourselves as individuals, and that includes, I think, kind of understanding and exploring different parts of our psyche to show up more wholly when we, connect with another person.
Are there some things that we should actually keep private from our partners, like going to the bathroom? I mean, we all know that our partners are human, but like, if the premise of this conversation is essentially that, like, a level of familiarity and relying on natural motivation to do things is a recipe for disconnect and failure, should we keep some parts of ourselves to ourselves?
Yes, I think we should, and I think this is what like Esther Perel was really trying to communicate in a lot of her material that a lot of people, like I was saying at the beginning, took that we, needed all of this distance and space, but there are plenty of ways to, create space. And part of that is having a little bit of privacy within a relationship around things like going to the bathroom. And what I wanted to reiterate that came up earlier is I don't want people to think that you should only cohabitate with someone or maintain a long-term relationship because of economic stability or because it makes more economic sense to do so. We know from the research that people in, long-term relationships, romantic relationships in particular, feel their lives are more meaningful, they have better mental health, they have better physical health, they're, happier overall. So there are a lot of great reasons to maintain long-term relationships. I think that one of the most important things we can do in terms of maintaining some space is to think about the space we maintain emotionally. So, like, are you overly dependent on your partner to meet all of your emotional needs? If
Mm.
so, that will snuff the erotic flame. So I am a huge proponent of, maintaining a wide social support system. I mean, my husband and I, like, he goes out with his guy friends once every couple of weeks. I'm going out with my girlfriends all the time. We each take trips individually. We take plenty of trips together as a couple. So I think striking the right balance, and it looks different for every couple, between things you do independently and things you do together is going to be, the best recipe for maintaining connection and desire. Because when you go out into the world, you learn something new about yourself. And, when you're out with friends, maybe you're having conversations that you wouldn't otherwise have with your partner, and you bring that energy and sense of newness home, and that can create a sense of novelty even in sex without necessarily trying new things.
And that is because you're bringing new content to the relationship, because you're a
Yeah.
whole fulfilled individual outside of the relationship, which arguably is the version of you that your partner fell in love with in the beginning. You're a whole individual, independent person. And so often, I think when we go into relationships, long-term relationships, a lot of us lose our own identities. And I think it sounds to me like that's a recipe for problems in the bedroom even.
Yeah. Oh, completely. I mean, when you become too enmeshed with your partner, when you lose your sense of self to your relationship, the sex is going to suffer for sure. For sure. So, like, I see this with women all the time. I don't have a problem with women not working if that's what they want to do. But I'm always like, keep up your skills, maintain a license if that's what you have. Like,
Yeah.
always keep yourself employable, or at a minimum, do something that is just for yourself apart from your relationship and your responsibility to your children, whether it's, some kind of class or sitting on a board, like, have something that is just yours. Because if your whole identity, and again, this happens for women way more than men, if your whole identity is about your role as a wife and a mother, you're going to feel kind of sexually tapped out,
A-
uninterested.
And it's interesting that you mentioned that because there are some people who do genuinely love child rearing.
Mhm.
My next door neighbor she is way under 40 and she's got 4 kids and she might have a couple more, she says. She loves raising children. What she did before she met her husband was she worked in a daycare. She was an early childhood education major in college and she worked in a daycare. She loves raising children. And I think so let's put that aside for a second. And let me also tell you that in 30 years of clinical practice, almost 30 years, I'm in my 29th year now, some of the most depressed women I worked with were women who were not necessarily wanting their whole life to be child rearing, but they wanted to be stay at home moms, or they felt pressure either from their spouses or society to be stay at home moms. And like they like within 2 years became walking zombies. And there's nothing worse than having a depressed, anxious, resentful martyr wife or mother. So they do nobody any favor, by doing that.
Yeah.
It's not
Mhm.
serving anyone.
No.
But that is just to say the flip side. I agree with you. I think that for some people, that is truly their calling, but I think you know that real early on. I don't think you're ever on the
Yeah.
fence about having children. If that's what you're meant to do with your life, I really don't think you question having children. I think you've always felt an affinity towards
Right.
children. And I think you probably worked with children in a variety of ways before you ever became a mother. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, yes. And of course, there are always outliers. And this is not to say
Yes.
there is anything at all wrong with making that choice and hopefully loving it,
Right.
but I think
Surprises
that,
happen.
yeah, I mean, you look at, most of the, social media accounts on motherhood, and I think what a lot of mothers feel is kind of a love-hate relationship with it because it's tough. You inevitably can, you risk giving up parts of yourself, which I think creates some kind of resentment and feelings of anxiety, like what you're talking
Certainly.
about.
Yeah, it certainly can. And if they don't do what you're suggesting, which is maintaining aspects of like a third space or a second space, because if
Yeah,
you're going to be at stay-at-home mom, your home is your first space, then you've given up your second space, which is like your workspace. You need another space. You need there to be
right.
something else that is intellectually stimulating to you, because then what is going to happen when your kids grow up into the beautiful, amazing, independent beings that you've been trying to form all these years? You're going to feel like you've lost all your limbs.
Right. And the thing is we don't live in a village anymore. So women are doing this alone. I think it would probably be different if they were with a whole group of moms, with kids for the majority of the day, but they're not. They may have a play date once or twice a week, but that's it. They're
Hmm.
on their own with their kids, which depletes their energy and I think is one of the many reasons why women struggle to have enough energy left over for sex at the end of the day.
We Need to Talk is sponsored by Mindful Care. You might remember my friend, Dr. Tamir Aldad, from a few episodes back. He just texted to let me know that Mindful Care is now accepting new patients. We all know how hard it is to find an in network psychiatrist without a long wait list, but Mindful Care can see you same or next day for medication management, recovery, and group therapy. No wait. And they take Medicaid, Medicare, and commercial insurance. Visit mindfulcare.com or text or call 516 505 7200 to book your appointment today. What are some subtle signs that a couple might be sexually disconnected, even if things seem to be fine, like on the surface?
I think the first sign is when you notice that you're kind of dissociating during a sexual experience. Like if you find that it
Like
feels like you're
floating outside of your body? Like
yeah,
straight
or
up
if
clinical
you
dissociating
not
or
clinical dissociation, but that you just that it's starting to kind of feel like you're going through the motions, or if you start feeling like it's a chore and you're doing it even though you don't really want to, you no longer have that intrinsic motivation that we were talking about earlier. Those are some signs that you may need to start paying some closer attention to it,
and then
for sure.
what do you do? Because I mean, sex in a long-term relationship invariably does feel choreographed at times. So what does one do?
So I think the first thing to do is kind of assess what your relationship needs. Like the five secrets I outlined in the book, what I tell people to do is first stop and think, well, let me back up. I tell people to look at them more as a menu than a roadmap. It's not like you have to strike all five at once to have great sex. If you feel like you are living life like two ships passing in the night because you are so freaking busy and you are running around all day like a chicken with its head cut off, like open the sensuality chapter because there's a lot in there about re-inhabiting the body and getting in touch with the senses and how to fully immerse yourself in the sensual experience of sex, which is, one of the many things that can make it so pleasurable. If you feel like you're kind of stuck in a routine and things have gotten monotonous, well, take a look at the curiosity chapter because that's all about the psychology of sexual novelty. And, there's some really great tips in there about how to start making things interesting in a way that's not, intimidating or overwhelming. If you're feeling kind of emotionally disconnected in your relationship, well, the vulnerability chapter has a ton on that component. If you feel like there's a relationship hurdle or, conflict, or suddenly you have like a sick parent, you have to take up like a big challenge that you're facing as a couple. And that is making it hard to prioritize sex, then the adaptability chapter has stuff on that. So it really, I think, depends on what the origin of the disconnect is, which might look different for different people.
And how does a layperson figure that out? Because I would imagine that, if somebody is listening to this and they're noticing that, well, I mean, I'm not necessarily going through the motions, but I certainly know the motions forward and backwards because they're always forwards. They're never backwards. They're
Right.
always one direction.
Yeah.
Um, how would they know which category? I guess you got to read the whole book, folks. You read the
Take a
book
look
from
at the
beginning to
book.
end.
Right, exactly. Please. No, I think, just starting with a conversation with your partner, because a lot of times, like, we'll notice there's a little bit of a disconnect, but because we feel like maybe we lack the tools to do anything about it, or we assume that our partner is happy with the way things are, we just don't say anything until it's like an elephant in the room. So I tell people to open the conversation with something along the lines of, I've felt a little bit disconnected sexually, or I noticed our sexual interaction has started to shift. I just wonder if you're feeling the same way, and if so, like, what do you think is going on? We can learn so much, I think, just again by asking like these open-ended questions. We've got to stay curious about what's going on with ourselves and with our relationship and with our partner, because they may have stuff that they haven't expressed to you for the same reasons that maybe they think, you wouldn't care, you haven't noticed. So it's good to just do, kind of periodic relationship check-ins, so that you are kind of both aware of any problems that may be bubbling below the surface. Because I mean, I have couples come in after they have been stuck in a sexual disconnect for like years, and
Mhm.
they've never really talked about how they got from point A to point B, because it seemed to happen right under their noses, because they were just going through the motions of life and stopped having real, conversations about the health of their relationship. In a way, while it might sound unsexy, you've got to stay on top of things and sometimes have conversations about what's going on in your relationship that you need to pay attention to prevent problems from developing.
To that end, and because I know, I'm a relationship therapist, I only work with individuals, I don't work with couples. My wife works with couples.
Mhm.
Um, and we know how terrifying serious conversations are for our clients. And as a way to desensitize them to the fear that the topic's going to go off the rails in a serious conversation, and also as a way of teaching them that they can use serious conversations to connect, to feel better attached and attuned, and to feel more secure in the relationship, and also to address, any concerns that either of them has. We recommend that people have a 1 hour a week relationship meeting, which we do as well. And it's like this 1 hour where if there were something during the week that I would generally be like, it's not that big a deal, I'm more inclined to bring that to
Yeah.
staff in that relationship meeting because we're both already prepared for it. She's not being ambushed. Um, but I feel for the listeners because I know that you and I are making this sound so reasonable, so normal. And I also know what it's like to be a normal person in a relationship who does not want to rock the boat, who doesn't know if she should mention something because I don't want my partner to suddenly have a new insecurity or a new concern to then preoccupy her mind with. How do you recommend that people have these difficult conversations when they need to, especially checking in around sex?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, I too am a proponent of a weekly check-in, and I have like a handout that I give all of my couples in the first session, that goes through things like current challenges or complaints with requests for change. And to your point, it's great because everyone comes prepared to talk about potentially difficult things. But what ends up happening if you're having those conversations regularly, you actually avoid nagging. You
Yes.
avoid, you avoid little molehills from developing into mountains that then become really, really challenging conversations to have. Of course, you don't want to go into these little meetings making it all about like criticizing each other. In fact, my check-in opens with appreciations and things
Mine
that
too.
worked really well. So, I think we need to give just as much energy to the good. But when we have these conversations with more regularity, we become better communicators. And the same principle really applies to sex. Like the more regular you're having sex, the less likely it is to ever feel awkward because you're kind of keeping your skills nice and polished. So yeah, I mean, we've got to be active and intentional and mindful about maintaining both emotional and sexual connection, or it will fall by the wayside.
Because again, what happens in the beginning is we don't have to be mindful. We are so naturally motivated by these chemicals that as we're falling in love, we're energized, as you said.
Yeah.
And it all seems to come so effortlessly. And then as those neurochemicals dissipate over time, we begin to think there's something wrong with the match between us and our partner because what used to be effortless and mindless, now you have to actually, oh, I'm kind of tired. It's a Friday night. I guess I should make a dinner reservation for us to go out, even though I would much rather Netflix and chill. Yeah. Yeah, you
Yeah.
should make that
Yeah.
reservation.
You absolutely should. And back to the neurochemicals, when we are in a flow state, we get an even stronger hit of neurochemicals than we do in the honeymoon stage. So, in addition to a surge of dopamine and norepinephrine, we get epinephrine, which is kind of a natural analgesic. We get a boost in serotonin. So
I
instead
was
of
just going to say,
serotonin
yeah, dip.
dropping like it did early, we actually get an increase. We get a nice hit of anandamide, which kind of makes our body feel charged up and enhances focus and attention. So you actually get a lot more of a rush when you are in a flow state than you do just in the honeymoon stage.
Which is amazing and important for listeners to hang on to and process because it means that throughout the course of your long term relationship, if you can access that state, you can potentially have a better sex life than you did in the very beginning.
Which is what all of my research participants said.
I
None
love
of
that.
them talked about the honeymoon stage sex being the best sex ever. They talked about the sex that happened years down the line once they had lived life together. I mean, I talked to people who'd been together over 25 years and they had gotten to a place where they were far more in sync with one another. I think there's too great of an emphasis on communication strategies, especially when it comes to sex. And that's all good in terms of like a first step. But these
Yeah.
people had gotten to the point where, they were so attuned to one another, they could read each other's nonverbal cues and they didn't have to stop and talk through everything. Think of a sports team who they get into a flow state when they're
That's
out on
right.
the field and they cannot stop and talk through every single play, or the other team would go for the goal. So that level of attunement and synchrony only happens when we have practice, I think, with the same person for a
Hmm.
period of time.
Yeah, miles and miles under our belt. That's
Mhm.
totally true. We know over time, over the course of any long term relationship, certainly in a marriage that spans decades, that there's going to be periods of time where we are all sexless. Can you talk more about that? How many times in a long term relationship should a couple expect to be sexless, and then for how long?
So, libido can go to sleep for a little while for very good reasons. Like I said before, like having a new baby, like the body is not designed like when women are breastfeeding, you have, hormones surging through your bloodstream that make you like completely uninterested in sex. Your
Hmm.
estrogen drops, which leads to vaginal dryness. Like it's just not a sexy time for a lot of people. so that you will pay attention to your new
To your
baby.
baby.
I mean, it just makes evolutionary sense. Or under really long periods of stress, whether it's work or someone's going through, some mental health issues, or you're, on the cusp of a major transition. Like, there are just going to be periods in life where maybe you have to focus on other things. But this is where I fall back to looking outside the box for things that you can do to at least maintain some physical proximity and connection, even if it's not sexual,
Mm-hmm.
because what that will do is kind of maintain those neural pathways, especially as it relates to some of the sensuality stuff, so
Mm-hmm.
that when eventually, hopefully, things do begin to wake back up again, it won't feel like as big of a leap to get from point A to point B.
So I'm annoying here, and I'm sorry for that.
It's
How
okay.
many
I
times
know.
should we expect to go sexless?
Oh gosh. I mean, I would have to pull like a number. I don't know. I can't really give you like an evidence-based answer to that question. I would have to look at the research because, I think most couples, what I will say, just to kind of reiterate, is most couples will talk about having gone through dry spells, but I would have to go look at the research to tell you like specifically how many dry spells the average couple in a long-term relationship goes through. I don't know the answer to that.
What about just in your experience with your couples?
Yeah, I mean, well, keep in mind my sample is kind of skewed towards people who are having issues, and so when Peggy Kleinplatz pioneered a lot of research in optimal sexual experiences. And in her first research study, she didn't even bother talking to people who were under the age of 65. Like, most of her research participants had been together for 20, 30 years. But again, I mean, they had all talked about going through a few periods in life. I would say, if I really had to like just give kind of a guess based on everything I've read and everyone I've talked to, over the course of like, let's say 30 years together, you could probably expect to go through like 4 to 6 dry spells.
That
Does that
seems
seem
reasonable to me.
reasonable?
Yeah, it
Yeah.
does. And I appreciate your commitment to being research grounded. I really
Mhm.
do appreciate that. But also, I want to normalize it for people because I
Mhm.
think that people, especially young adults, when they hit their first dry spell, I mean, the women all blame themselves.
Right.
Uh, Oftentimes, the men blame the women, which
Yeah.
is a whole other conversation, or nobody's talking about it and they're privately blaming themselves. And I just want to normalize it a little bit for people so that we understand this happens. Here's what we need to do to try and either minimize the number of times in your long-term relationship that it's going to happen or mitigate it some of those times by staying
Yeah.
connected in some of the ways that you suggested.
Yeah, and there's been some kind of new research that came out not too long ago looking at reasons for sexual disconnect in midlife, and a lot of people immediately think it's
Oh,
because of women
please.
going through menopause, but no. It is because men become insecure about their erections, essentially, that their erections become less
Mhm.
predictable, and so they
Yeah.
start pulling back from sex, but it's real easy to blame more women's hormonal shifts, but that's actually not what the research is pointing to. And that's because, so many couples, not I was going to say men, but really both men and women, sex begins with the male erection and ends with the male orgasm in heterosexual
Mhm.
couples. And
Mhm.
we have got to take a broader view of what constitutes sex. And the couples in my research study who sustained passion, like I said, they didn't narrow it down to such a little script. I mean, they had very broad views of what sex could be. But yeah, I think when couples start going through dry spells in midlife, it's not all the women. It's because men get
Yeah.
insecure about the
Yeah.
unreliability is the word I was looking for earlier, the unreliability of their erections.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a real thing.
Mhm.
As well as blaming women for that. So how can couples emerge from having a sexless chapter? What are
Mhm.
three go-tos that you give to your clients?
So first I would say ease into it. You can start to get back into an erotic space without getting into a sexual space. right away. So start flirting with one another, touch each other, do something new as a couple. Like there's really great research on self-expansion. Couples who tried something new, like shucking an oyster for the first time, were 36 times more likely to have sex the next day, like not twice as likely, like it was pretty much guaranteed that they were going to have sex. So trying new things together and as an individual can do a lot to kind of wake up that erotic energy. We have to come back to this word erotic. What that means for a lot of people is a sense of aliveness. It's an energy. It's kind of a sense of immersion. And, I'm thinking back to your question earlier about if people needed to get into a flow state outside the bedroom in order to know how to tap into it inside the bedroom. And while I don't know the specific answer to that, I will say that I think anything that makes you feel alive that may not have to do with sex is going to awaken your own erotic charge. And so that's something that I think couples can start doing, and it ends up being a big relief to people because I think people try to like jump into bed sometimes too quickly after going through a dry spell, and it can feel like a little too much too fast,
Mm.
because it doesn't feel as, quote unquote, effortless as it did early on when things were new because you've been together for a long time. So that's one. I would say ease into it, do things together outside of the bedroom to start awaken that erotic charge. The other thing I would say is to push through the initial awkwardness. People always ask, like, how do we start having sex again without it feeling awkward? And I'm like, you don't. Because anything you haven't done in
Yeah.
a long time is going to feel awkward. If
Yeah.
you used to love, I don't know, skateboarding, and it's been 5 years since you got onto a skateboard, and pull your skateboard out and you get on, like you're gonna have to take some time, like regaining your balance. It applies to anything, but for some reason, like people just think great sex should happen automatically without any effort, and that's just not the case. So you've got to be willing to push through any feelings of awkwardness. And then I think the third thing would be to have really heartfelt, open, honest conversations about what, if any, adjustments you may need to make in this season of life. Thinking, assuming that maybe it's been some time since you last had a strong sexual connection, because chances are there have been some major shifts. And, if maybe the connection was lost because you had little kids at home, and 2 years in, like you still got kids at home, you need to talk about what you may need to do to work around that because they're not going anywhere. So I think just having conversations about what you can each do to commit to making it a priority, and work with, not against, any barriers that may be in place is a really key step to reconnecting.
Yeah, including getting some, like, babysitting relief,
Yeah,
right?
childcare.
And carving some time away from the kids maybe. I can imagine that it would be really difficult,
Yeah.
to 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 get all of those needs met while also having mother's ears.
Look, I get it. I mean, I have a 4 and a 6-year-old, and I'm right in the thick of it. And my husband and I, we have to be very intentional about, when we can connect, because otherwise it won't happen. So I really do practice what I preach. And
I
I can
mean,
promise you it works if you work it.
I could never not practice what I preach, so I
Yeah.
absolutely believe that. I would feel like such a fraud, and I couldn't do what I do.
No.
I would find a different career.
Yeah.
If I was like acting terribly in my personal life and not doing the things that I teach day in and day out, I would have to find a different, I don't know, one of those two things would have to change, either my relationship or my career, probably my career.
For sure.
So if a couple is coming out of a dry spell, you would not, am I correct in understanding that you would not recommend like an immersive sex workshop
Hmm.
as a solve?
I mean, that's one way to do it, I suppose, and I like the idea of a workshop because you've got some external support, I suppose, if,
Or
things,
pressure, depending on how
yeah,
you
some
feel in the
accountability, let's say. Yeah, exactly. And you've got the time set aside and carved out. No, I mean, I think workshops are great. I mean, I do a lot of intensives with my couples, not just about, jumping back into bed, but I do like an intensive approach because I think when you set aside a significant chunk of time to, reconnect, it just allows you to get in deeper more quickly than if it's just little bits of time spread out. And in fact, coming back to flow state science, we know that flow happens in a series of 4 stages. The first stage is the struggle phase. Again, like think of a surfer who, has to kind of warm up, maybe do some stretches, wax their board. There's some preparation. They're paddling out. They don't know if like a great swell is going to come. And in that stage, regardless of what your activity is, there is kind of an initial flood of cortisol and stress hormones. And again, I think this is where people throw in the towel when it comes to sex because
Yeah.
you don't feel immersed in it as soon as you get into bed. And so they're like, well, it's just not going to be good, rather than giving them their bodies time to transition from the struggle phase to the release phase, which is when that cortisol starts to work its way out and the body starts to relax. And then after that, you get into the flow state. But the problem is that a lot of couples just don't even have sex for as long as it takes to get into a state of flow. Now, I think there are plenty of things you can do leading up to it that will help, make that transition easier. But, yeah, I mean, that could be one reason why like a workshop intensive could be great because it forces you very quickly to push through that struggle phase. Back to what I was saying about it feeling awkward at first, like that's the struggle phase for sure.
Is what you were saying that people tend to, and I think you're talking about like a heteronormative
Yeah.
perspective in particular. I'm suspecting, I don't know, that if that people, heterosexuals tend to have sex for too short an amount of time so that the woman's not able to reach that. So basically, they're having sex the way movies show us to
Yeah.
have sex. So it's
Precisely.
like pull the pants down and then
Yeah,
couple
jump into
kisses and then
bed, no
jump right in.
foreplay. Yeah.
Zero flaw.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, yes. If you want to get into a state of flow, you're going to have to carve out a little more time to get there, And that's not going to happen maybe every time you have sex, but what I have found is I've started using this approach with couples is if they carve out extra time for sex, at least some of the time, that energy spills over into more run-of-the-mill sexual experiences, and they end up having more satisfying sex in between than they did, before they started using this flow state approach. So it's worth it. It's worth it.
I also wonder how often men who are used to, you mentioned for heterosexuals, sex begins with the erection and it ends with the ejaculation, both of which are fairly effortless for the first third of a man's life. I can't help but wonder if when men begin to experience erectile dysfunction issues, like they're either not able to achieve an erection or
Yeah.
maintain an erection, if it's so horrifying that they don't realize that a lot of that could be worked through literally with the foreplay that you've never been taught to engage in.
Yes. Like
Is that
100%.
that's a thing,
Yes,
right?
yes. It takes both men and women longer to get aroused as we age. It takes both men and women longer to have an orgasm as we age. This is what the adaptability chapter in the book is all about. People who hold sexual destiny beliefs kind of believe that whatever the way their sexuality manifests itself early on is the way it will always be. And then when it is no longer that way, then they stop having it. Versus people who hold what we refer to as sexual growth beliefs are always kind of open and willing to think outside the box and navigate some of these challenges. And okay, so I didn't get an erection. Like, what's something else fun we can do? What other parts of my body feel good? Oh, we've never explored that. Like, let's give that a try and see if it helps enhance arousal. So, that mentality is going to be really important.
I love how throughout this conversation you have bridged theory and research and you've put it into such practical, understandable terms. I really
Mhm.
appreciate that about you. And I
Yeah.
don't know if my listeners know this, but that is such a unique skill and talent. There are people who can do it and can't explain it. They can do it in their private practice. They can
Mhm.
understand the research, but they can't teach it. Other people who can teach, but they're not rooted in science or evidence-based practices. And you are rooted in both. And I really appreciate that about you. Thank you so much. Where can people learn more about you?
Thank you so much, and that's such a nice compliment because that was really a big goal that I had. So thank you. So I am on all the social media channels at Dr. Emily Jamea, Dr. Emily Jamea, and my website emilyjamea.com. Right now, if you order the book, you get access to tons of free resources on my website. I've got PDFs. You get access to my online workshop. So there's like hundreds of dollars worth of bonuses right now that you can get for a pre-order. So check that out. And I also have a podcast called Love and Libido. So if you're a podcast listener, check that out too.
I love that. Thank you so much for your time today. You are a rock star and you're going to
Oh,
rise. I'm looking forward to seeing it.
thank you, Dr. Darcy. It's my pleasure.
We Need to Talk with Dr. Darcy Sterling is a Sterling Standard production. Editing and sound engineering is by Bart Miguel. Our theme music is by Trending Music. Special thanks to Amanda Christiani and Preston Smith. If you know someone in a long-term relationship, since you now know that they will eventually go sexless at some point, show them some love and text them this episode. We'll be back on Tuesday with another episode packed with the dating, relationship, and mental health hacks you have come to expect. We'll see you soon.